You know, the world's a scary place sometimes. And if you've been reading the headlines this week, heck, even if you've just been living your life this week, you don't really need me to tell you this. The world is a scary, scary place. Russia. Russia was a scary place even before the recent headlines, especially if you happen to be an LGBT person. And now Russia is a scary place if you happen to be any person anywhere near the Ukraine. That's scaring people all over the world. Africa. Wow. News from Africa is very scary. We're looking at horrific persecution of LGBT people in Uganda and Nigeria, and it seems to be spreading. Please keep these people in your prayers. This is happening in a lot of places. And the world is full of economic insecurity and crime and scary climate change and hate and terrorism. Scary stuff. And over the past few weeks, our lessons for life have been looking at new beginnings, looking for the ways that we can learn from our missteps in life, ways in which we can quit letting them limit and define us, ways that we can renew our sense of gratitude and love, ways that we can reclaim our authentic selves and restore relationships, ways that we can find our way to true peace and joy and hope. And today, I want to conclude that sermon series by looking at how we can make new beginnings, making a fresh start in our lives by replacing fear with love. No fear, no love. So everybody has fears. You know what's really scary? Bears. Bears, especially grizzly bears. Grizzly bears are big and powerful and aggressive and unpredictable, and you know they can run over 40 miles an hour. I can't. I don't run at all. If you ever see me running, you should run too, because there's probably a bear behind me. They can weigh more than half a ton. They can stand over 10 feet tall. They have 4-inch fangs and 6-inch razor-sharp claws. They have an extremely powerful bite. It's estimated that the jaws of a grizzly bear can crush a bowling ball. And grizzly bears don't think anything is scary. They're the top of the food chain, so most of them have no fear of anything at all. Grizzly bears. That is what's scary. I was actually thinking of showing a picture of a big old spider instead of a bear, but I thought Diane would be here, and then there would be no music for the second half of the service. And more to the point, I'm afraid of Diane. See, sometimes our fears are completely rational. Fortunately, bear-human interactions are fairly rare, and if you're cautious and sensible, you can avoid being eaten by a bear. If you're hiking, you can take precautions like making a lot of noise and wearing bear bells. And between services, Janet told me, you got to explain to these people what bear bells are. And I said, honey, they're Canadian, they know. And she said, they live in Toronto. So bear bells are bells that you put like on your pack and your boots and stuff if you're hiking in the backcountry, so that the bear knows that you're coming, so the bear can avoid you or sharpen his fangs. And if you're camping, you should tie your food up in a tree, and you should definitely avoid feeding the bears. Do not feed the bears, because you do not want them to associate you with food. Okay, once they begin to associate human habitation with food, they'll keep returning to it. And that's a bad thing for both the humans and the bears. What if we think of our fears the way we think of bears? If we keep feeding them, they'll keep hanging around, growing bigger and more vicious with every scrap we throw their way. But if we start feeding the fears, eventually they'll slink off into the woods and leave us alone. Sometimes we give our fears too much of ourselves. We feed them with the energy and time that we could be using to build a life more in line with our deepest desires. And our fears get in the way of our opportunities. They keep us from reaching our greatest potential, and freeing ourselves from fear is the first step toward a life that we want to have. Now, if you're not a grizzly bear, and looking out over the congregation, I don't actually see any of that sort of bear, there may be a few things that you're afraid of. Sometimes, as I said, fear is a legitimate response to the world and to life, and reasonable or normal fear protects us from danger. Folks who've served in combat, for instance, say, if you're not afraid then, you're just not sane. And it's completely reasonable to take steps to protect ourselves and others from danger. Remember the bear bells? On the other hand, abnormal or excessive fear is a monster that can paralyze or destroy as well as any bear. And if you're human, and I think most of us here are, then fear is a natural and sometimes even a sensible response to the world. There is a lot to be afraid of, because the world has always been a scary place. Every generation has had great big scary things to face. For my parents' generation, it was World War II and the Holocaust. For my grandparents, it was the Great Depression. For my generation, it's been indelibly marked by AIDS. Scary stuff. But in the end, thank God, we often rise above our fears. Back in World War II, that greatest generation saved the world for us. In recent years, the folks who cared for and nursed and buried people with AIDS, they're heroes. And they rose above their fears. And we all have fears, both great and small. What are some of the things people are afraid of? Okay, spiders, fear of flying, fear of the dark, fear of illness, crime, not being accepted by others. A couple of weeks ago, Brent talked about a fear of commitment. And I think sometimes that's related to a fear of failure or even a fear of success. Some of us may fear being alone. And maybe we fear getting old and the related financial and medical and relational issues that affect our quality of life. Or maybe we fear the possibility of unemployment or underemployment or homelessness and relationship breakups or a host of other life circumstances that rattle our cages. And we may have perfectly legitimate reasons to fear any of those things. But fear is not something we like to experience. Fear happens when something very much unwanted and unexpected invades our experience, and we don't know what to do with it. And fear, even rational fear, by its very nature, means that we can't rationally take things step by step. It's a very messy emotion. And when we let fear take over our lives and paralyze us, I think sometimes that's when the fear wins. Years ago, when I was still a lawyer, my firm hired a guy who was a pretty decent lawyer, but he had a lot of insecurities. And he worried constantly that he wasn't good enough. And he actually did pretty good work. But the more anxious he became, the less he was able to do it. And eventually, he needed to leave and go into another line of work. And later he told me that when he was still practicing law, the problem was that he'd be working on a project and he just couldn't keep at it, couldn't keep working on it because he was so afraid that he would mess up, that he couldn't get his work done. And his fear of failure became a downward spiral that actually caused him to fail at what he wanted so desperately to do, all because of fear. How do we overcome fears? Well, facing our fears necessarily involves risk. The French writer Anaïs Nin put it this way, and the day came when the risk to remain tight in a bud was more painful than the risk it took to blossom. When we push beyond our fears, that's when we blossom. But in facing them, we necessarily confront risk and vulnerability. And our work in the face of fear is to come to peace with vulnerability. As people of faith, we claim a God who decided to love the world by entering into the messiness, the fear, the uncertainty, in order to transform it. And in the midst of an insecure and volatile world, Jesus came and lived among us. And he preached good news, and he healed the sick, and he challenged the authorities, and he refused to use violence, and he lost his life. And in the face of all that, what did he say over and over and over again? Fear not. Fear not. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a copper coin? Do not fear. You are of more value than many, many, many sparrows. And we're called to that same vulnerability that Jesus embraced and modeled. I think a lot of our fears are rooted in a sense of insecurity and the desire for greater security. And as people of faith, we need to balance the human desire for security with an honest recognition that we will never eliminate all vulnerability from our lives, that risk-taking is just an essential part of life. And our real security is a God who loved the world enough to enter into it in all of its messiness. And if we're to be people who live out our mission to transform lives and transform the world, then the work we're called to do in the face of fear is to love the world around us. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. And we know that fear can be so debilitating. It paralyzes us and robs us of joy and of life. In a few minutes we'll sing, "Love is but a song we sing, and fear's the way we die." Fear's the way we die. If we're to be people with an alternative message than that of the world's culture of fear, we need to tap into a source of life-giving love that can strengthen us to love extravagantly when the messages around us are telling us to be cautious. And I know that's not easy. And I'm afraid I'm not a very good example of how to do it, because I have plenty of my own fears, which is one reason there wasn't a picture of a snake up there. But I do know how it works, and I know that it does, because I learned from a great teacher, someone much younger than myself. I have 4 wonderful grandsons, and they're all handsome and brilliant and talented and amazing. And the youngest one, when he was very little, maybe around 5, was an unusually self-sufficient little guy, remarkably self-actualized in a way that I don't usually see even in adults, even particularly mature adults who've had a lot of therapy. And I aspire to be more like him. He had remarkable self-confidence for a 5-year-old. He just assumed he could do anything, and he did it. And my late wife, Ann, and I used to watch him just in amazement and awe. And one day I asked her how she thought he got to be that way. And she mused that she thought it might be because he knew he was loved and assumed he always would be. Perfect love casts out fear. When we're afraid, may we remember that we are loved and always will be. So be not afraid. I think it's generally well known that I spend way too much time online, but sometimes I actually learn good stuff. And there's a guy I'm friends with on Facebook. He's a Native American Episcopal bishop, Anglican, named Stephen Charleston. And he posts a daily prayer, and sometimes when I find one especially moving, I repost it. I did this morning. And I'd like to close with a prayer that he posted the other day, and it's my prayer for all of us. I invite everyone to join me in living a fear-free day. No matter how grave my own situation may seem, no matter how difficult the struggles of the world, I want to live these hours without being afraid. I will believe that my life is in the hands of a loving power that will help me find my way through any hardship. I will believe that peace and goodness will heal the broken world in which we live. I will not despair. I will not surrender to resignation. I will let my fears go, dropping them at my feet, as I rise to feel the lightness of my spirit when all it knows is faith unfettered. Amen.